everyone. I'm Gigi Wang. I'm an exchange student from Beijing, China this semester. It's really great honor for me to introduce our guest speaker for tonight, Scott Kupor, managing partner at Andreessen Horowitz, a $7 billion venture capital firm. Mr. Kupor has managed all facets of the firm's growth over its nearly 10 years history. And he is also widely recognized as an expert in the venture capital industry. He is often invited to speak at industry conferences, also the author of The Secrets of Sand Hill Road. And besides, he has appeared multiple times on the CNBC's Squawk Box and been quoted in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Fortune, and Bloomberg. And besides this, he also has testified the venture capital and blockchain policy in front of congressional and SEC committees. Beyond that, he teaches at the Hart School of Business and both School of Law at Cal. Now, let's welcome Scott Kupor with a warm applause. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
What?
Oh, thank you.
Yes. Just shameless plug. We're just going to do the shameless plug first. There we go. Just hold the camera for 5 seconds.
In terms of timing, Scott has a book that's coming out early June.
Right.
So this is perfect in terms of
Right there, yeah.
You've got nothing else to do on your summer break, so you may as well do some reading, right?
Well, I have had this book for one day, for about 7 hours, and I did read through it as quickly as possible.
Okay,
It's the best part of it is the term sheet.
Oh,
I have
you
to
like
say.
the term
That
sheet, okay.
So he has many of you have asked me, what does a standard term sheet look like? What's normal, what's not? It's in here. So it's worth buying the book for that. I think Eric Ries says the same thing, but that's actually really, really useful. So
All right, yeah, I guess we can get started. Is it on?
yeah.
All right, just making sure. All right. So, of course, I'm here at Berkeley, a student and everything. So go back, many years ago, going back to your college days. What did you originally want to do? Because, everyone says, oh, I never actually planned to be a VC. So what were your, lifelong plans back then?
Yeah, so it's always hard being here at Berkeley because I went to a lesser-known school down the freeway about 50 miles, and my wife is a Cal graduate though, so I feel like I can at least show my face here. Actually, believe it or not, or maybe believe it, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. That was my original thought, and I'm not quite sure where that came from, other than I remember when I was doing college applications after my junior year of high school. I think I applied to Harvard, which I did not get into, and you had to write, one of the essays was, tell us about the last 3 books you've read and why, and so I kind of scrambled. I realized I better actually read some books so that I could answer this question. And one of them I read was by a professor at Harvard called Alan Dershowitz, who some of you may have seen. He's actually, funny enough, he's on Fox News these days, which I never would have guessed if you have read his stuff. But anyway, so I just that kind of got me interested in it. And so that was my original goal when I went to school, and I majored in public policy, which was probably the closest thing I could find to something along those lines.
So then what happened? Literally, it's like, what happened, honestly?
Yeah, a lot of things happened. I think what happened, so what first happened, I think, was I realized that the practice of law was different from what I thought it was. And so like a lot of people, at least in my generation, which sounds kind of funny to say, but like a lot of people, I went pretty much straight through school. So, unlike business school, a lot of, at least in the past, law schools are now actually taking more students who've had some work experience. But in general, at least in those days, people used to go straight through law school. And so I had this view of what I thought a lawyer was. And then what happens in law school is you get to do summer internships because you've got at least 2 summers. And what I found was I loved intellectually the law, and I still do, actually, quite frankly, but I found that to me that the practice of law was very different than kind of the intellectual consequences or the intellectual thought that I had when I was in law school. Mm-hmm. And so probably, it was a very expensive lesson to learn, of course, having already committed myself to doing it and spending a bunch of money on law school. Right. But I think that's basically what happened along the way, was I kind of woke up one day and discovered that the practice of law was different. There's a great book also, I'm sorry to reference books, but for any of you who are interested, there's a great book called The Lost Lawyer, for any of you who are thinking about going to law school. It's by also a Harvard professor named Arthur Kronman. And what he writes about is kind of like a history of the legal profession in the United States, and he talks about a lot about how the practice of law has changed over time. And for those of you who follow this, law firms used to be, what he paints this picture of, law firms used to be kind of business counselors to CEOs. And then over time, as happens with a lot of organizations, billable hours and other things kind of got in the way. And so it became a much more transactional relationship. And so I read that book and I kind of had this epiphany that was what I had this vision of what a lawyer was that unfortunately was probably 50 years in the rearview mirror and had to figure out something else to do.
Yeah, so it kind of just seems like, as like life goes along, you make pivots, make changes,
Absolutely.
right? So even just coming back to your undergrad years, most of you are undergrads, any big mistakes you made, anything like say like, wow, this is actually a great learning experience for me, and then they kind of help shape your career forward.
Yeah, I actually was a transfer student at Stanford, so I did my freshman year at Wharton.
Okay.
And I thought that okay, I'm gonna be hardcore business school student. And to me, what was the most eye-opening thing, and I think the best thing that I did in undergraduate was when I got to Stanford, I finally kind of was forced to, because they had a little bit more of a general curriculum, I was forced to kind of just do some stuff in other areas. And I took religious studies classes, and I took some philosophy classes. And for the first time, at least in my academic career, I found that I actually liked intellectual pursuits. I liked talking to students about other stuff like that, and it was fantastic. And I had my other courses, which were more problem set oriented classes as well. But that was probably the most eye-opening thing that happened for me. And it was just a fascinating experience. And for anybody who's been to Wharton, at least at the time, was a very different student body. It was a very pre-professional student body where kind of a lot of people knew exactly what they were looking to do when they came. And I went to a place like Stanford, which I imagine is very similar to being here at Berkeley, where you've certainly got, there's some students who are very clear about what they're doing. But to me, the most interesting experience about undergraduate was just meeting different people, learning different things, opening my eyes to new experiences, and quite frankly, just building relationships and starting, we didn't call it networks at the time, but this idea of building relationships and kind of paying it forward from a network perspective is kind of something I first learned.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that completely, because I'm originally from Chicago. And Chicago, it's very, one side focused, finance heavy, and then coming out here to the Bay Area, it's there's so much going on, there's so much technology, innovation in that sense. So that's really exciting to hear. And actually, I remember, I think it was one question that some students had here, just, also from my own experience, just looking at it, VC industry is just something that's something like a career end. So how do you get there? Do you go out the entrepreneurial path or investment banking? What are your perspectives on that?
Yeah, so I get this question a lot from students, and look, and I kind of agree with you. I think there's two places to potentially get involved in the VC industry. So there are some VC firms who will in fact hire people, sometimes out of college, but other times maybe out of business school. And those tend to be what I would call kind of terminal jobs, in the sense that they have kind of start dates and end dates, and they're fantastic places where I think you can learn stuff. And so there aren't very many of those jobs, but if you're lucky enough to get one of those, I think that's a fantastic place to go. The other place I think to go is exactly as you said, maybe not at the end of your career, but at a stage where I think you've had enough operational experience in a company where you can be credible with other entrepreneurs, right? So if you think about, what does an entrepreneur want from a VC in addition to money, right? But there's lots of places you can get money, is at some point in time, you want to be able to say, look, I've seen the company building process, through my own eyes, and how can I be valuable to you as either a new CEO or somebody who hasn't had experience? And so, I think the other career path into VC is do something that's more operationally oriented. It doesn't mean you don't have to go start a company if you don't have an idea to start a company. That's wonderful if you do. But getting in at least at a point where you're kind of in, as much of a hyper-growth situation you can be in, where, kind of the job descriptions are still amorphous, so you get lots of kind of opportunity to do different things, where you have, a manager who is thinking about, okay, how can I help you from a career development perspective? And whether the company is successful or not is not really the question, right? Because look, you might be lucky. You might be lucky to find Facebook in 2005, and that's great. You could be sitting on a beach somewhere retired, but the chances are you're probably not going to figure that out. And so the question is more, what's the experience you can have, and how can you learn the pieces of the company building process in a way that creates those building blocks, either to go do it again in the entrepreneurship community or potentially kind of transition into VC.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. It's I've always heard this. It's the two-way relationship. It's like dating in that sense.
Yeah.
So anything you would have done differently?
In terms of dating?
Yeah.
No.
Well, also in terms of this as well, right? Looking at that.
Yeah. No, look, I don't know if I would do anything differently. My career was kind of, a bit circuitous, right? And so I think my career is a lot of luck of just kind of, hopefully doing things that you find are interesting, and then surrounding yourself with interesting people. So I'd say the biggest thing I would do differently, which I think it's a lesson I learned way too late in life, is, and it's, I'll be careful what I say here because we're in an educational and an academic institution, but The problem I think that a lot of us have is, for anybody who's here, obviously that means you've done incredibly well in school, right? You've had good grades, you've done great on tests, and those are wonderful, but those are all individual achievements. And as obvious, but it's not obvious until you see it. So much of work is kind of team and group-oriented experiences, and everybody can't get an A at the end of the day in many markets, right? At some point, often, not every market's a zero-sum market, but there are places where kind of relative performance matters sometimes more than absolute performance. And so, to me, I think if I could do it all over again, I would work hard to do extremely well on the individual side, but then I would probably that extra hour that I might have spent at the library. To me, if you invested that time in relationship development, whatever that is, just building a friendship or having coffee with somebody, because so much of what happens over time is interpersonal relationships and kind of that dynamic. And look, I was incredibly lucky, which is I happened to be at an investment bank where one of the individuals on an IPO I did joined this company called LoudCloud that Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz started. And that's the only reason that I got introduced to them almost 20 years ago is because I knew somebody who took a job who said, hey, these are interesting folks, you ought to meet them. And that's all luck of timing and stuff, but I think it just goes to the broader point of thinking about relationship development in the context of how do you kind of sow seeds that might kind of pay some dividends down the road is something I think probably we'd all do better off if we thought more about that, in addition to doing, obviously, all the hard work we have to do in school.
Right, that's incredibly important in that sense. But kind of a side note, well, if you weren't in VC, then what would you be doing? Would you be on the beach, hanging loose, or?
I would not be on the beach. Yeah, look, if I weren't here, quite frankly, what I'd love to be is my next job is I'd like to be an academic. So, in fact, actually, when I was in law school, I was enrolled in a joint PhD economics program in law school. And so the way it works there is you do your first year of law school, and then you're supposed to go do your first year of the econ program. And for some reason, I'm still not sure why I made this decision. I kind of decided that I wasn't prepared to do that, and so I kind of skipped out and just stayed in law school. And that's a big unknown regret that I have. And so, to me, writing this book, for example, I enjoy doing. I love teaching the classes that I do here. That would be something fun and interesting for me to do. And I don't want to be a politician, but maybe something in the policy world would be interesting to do as well. So I think those are the things, I would do if I weren't kind of sitting in this seat today.
Interestingly enough, Berkeley has the number 1, 2, or 3 program in all of the things that you just talked about.
That right?
Public
Okay,
policy, econ, law, I think in the top 5. Yeah.
Good.
So
okay. Well, all right. Well, maybe it's not too late.
Bears, right.
I might have missed the application deadline for this year, but I can, maybe.
Well, we can talk to some people. We know some people.
Okay.
Right. So I guess we're kind of talking about the future, the present. Maybe Ken, you want to take over in that sense?
Yeah. Is timing-wise, is that perfect?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. So I am the ghost of present. So of Christmas past here, present. So you have transitioned into becoming a venture capitalist, having had real experience in a startup. What were the things that you learned from being an entrepreneur that you were able to translate that made you a better venture capitalist?
Yeah, so let me just give you a little bit of history, right? So I joined a company called LoudCloud in the very end of 1999, and everyone in this room is too young to remember that, except for a few of us. But if you remember what happened in '99, it was like the height of euphoria in Silicon Valley. So companies were being started and going public. There was an article about companies going public these days. Companies were going public about 4.5 years after they had been started. And in many cases, they had 10, 12, $15 million of revenue. So it was a really aggressive time. And so we were a class of 1999 company. LoudCloud, by the way, again, just to explain it, we were basically trying to build Amazon Web Services is what we were trying to do. So we were not successful there. Like a lot of startup ideas, I think it was a good idea that probably would have benefited from 10 years of more of later time.
But the term cloud, does that come from you guys? Is that?
Yeah, so we didn't invent cloud, but I believe, at least as far as I know, I think we were the first company to ever use the word cloud as part of their business, right? So I'm a country music fan, so as I say, we were cloud before cloud was cool, right? So if you guys know, if anybody's a country music fan, you'll know what that's a reference
because
to.
we were using the term APIs, right?
Right, exactly.
So before you were all born, just to give you guys time context here, it wasn't about cloud and things like that. You had API, which was application was it like
Platform interface? Or?
interface? Yeah, it basically. Well, no, there's
program. It's probably program.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
So you had it was a different term for the same kind of model where you were plugging into existing services that you weren't creating yourself. You're plugging into them, what we now call the cloud.
Yeah.
So you're using other people's systems.
Yeah, the idea behind LoudCloud was exactly right? Which is we said, hey, look, if you're a developer, you ought to be able to just develop your code and, quite frankly, plug it into a utility. Just like, when I plug my phone in here to get power from my cell phone, I have no idea how the power got there. All I know, it's a utility, right? It just works, right? And so LoudCloud was the same idea, which is you shouldn't have to worry about the databases and the networking, gear and what servers it's running on. You ought to be able to build your code and just plop it onto this magical computer.
And the reality of that time, because I started a company in that same time period, it would take about probably a week for the DSL company to roll out and set up the connection. Then you had to buy servers.
Yes.
And when we say buy servers, it does not mean log into Amazon Web Services and buy a server virtually. This was, you literally went to Computer Central or somewhere, you bought physical devices. Right. Then you had to put all the software on there, and it would take possibly a week before you could start really coding anything on top of that. So when you guys can just instantiate an app, framework to build something, that would have taken us at least a week to do, and the vision for you guys was to make it what it is today.
That's exactly right. That was our hope, was that we could handle all that messiness, right? And we could do what obviously you can now do at Amazon Web Services, which is you don't really care what the back end is, right? You just you can call up an instance and it exists, and therefore you write to whatever platform you want to write to. So I've completely forgotten now the question, but we were talking about LoudCloud. What did I learn? I think that was the question, right? So look, I think the best things I learned were, number one is, you just learn empathy for the entrepreneurial process, right? I mean, you've been through it, and we all kind of suffer from this narrative fallacy, right? Which is we all look at success at companies, and then we kind of impute a story as to how they became successful, and with the passage of time, it looks like everything went smoothly up and to the right over time, right? It's very easy to envision that when you're looking from backwards, right? And the reality is, starting a company is, often a series of near-death experiences. And look, we suffered that at LoudCloud, right? We raised money in 1999, which was probably the headiest time ever to raise capital. And then, if you guys remember your history, April of 2000 is when NASDAQ peaked at 5,000, which I know sounds funny because we're now at 8,000, but believe it or not, it took more than a decade to go from 5,000 back to 5,000 not too long ago. And that was just the beginning. It ended up dropping, actually, it dropped all the way to 1,000. So basically, NASDAQ dropped 80%, between April 2000 and probably, I don't even know, end of 2001 or something was probably a low point. So, we grew like this. We hired 650 employees. We ended up kind of basically, doing multiple layoffs and getting down to about 80 employees, restarting the company, doing all kinds of stuff. And look, I mean, none of that was fun, but it was an incredible vantage point, to see and kind of have empathy for the company building process and understand that. And so, when some of our companies struggle today, I feel like, kind of having had that experience, we understand what that's like.
So you don't panic when...
Right, we don't panic, right? When we go to a board meeting, right, and you see a financial forecast that bears no resemblance to the forecast that you were pitched, we understand that, right? We know that's part of it, and that's right. We panic, as I like to say, we panic at the right times, hopefully, but not at the wrong times.
So that's actually a good segue. So when you're a venture capitalist, you get to see the insides of the boardroom with all these startups, right? And most of you have not seen this, other than on the show Silicon Valley, as we've talked about, which is 50% true, 50% not. You just don't know which 50%. So those are the heated moments that I think it's hard for us as educators to prepare our student entrepreneurs for, because we can't have simulations of saying, okay, here's a class, and this is what it's like to be in a boardroom. And this is how you're supposed to behave. This is how you're supposed to comport yourself. And these are the things you're not supposed to say. But you end up saying all of them anyway. Right. So, maybe you can give them an inside view of what that boardroom looks like and some do's and don'ts. What are the things that will get you fired as a CEO?
Yeah, there's a whole part of the book, as you know, right, that kind of is dedicated to this. But so I think the way to think about a board, at least in its failure case, it's a very orchestrated show, basically, right? Which is, and this is not, CEOs are not trying to mislead their boards, but CEOs ultimately determine what is presented to the board, and the board is only as good as the information that they receive, right? So I think the most important thing, if any of you go on to be entrepreneurs, or if you're going to be venture capitalists, is to recognize that no matter how smart you think you are, you have no idea as a venture capitalist or a board member what's actually happening inside the company. And that's not because people are actively trying to hide it from you. It's just that if you've ever been in a company, if you're the CEO, you know exactly what can this engineering group do and on what deadline and how is it working. And showing up at a board meeting once a month or once a quarter or whatever the frequency is, you're so far removed from the day-to-day what's happening in the business. And so a lot of what you intuit about the health of the business is a function of what the CEO presents to you. And so I think good CEOs do that well, which is they present a fair view of what's happening in the business, and then they also, I think, recognize what the board is there to do and what it's not to do, right? So the board's job is not to manage the company, right? And you know this again, having been there, but think of it as the way the board can affect management of the company is their ultimate power is to hire or fire the CEO. Right? I mean, that is their mechanism to actually say, look, we don't like ultimately what's happening in this company. We have to do that. And where I think bad boards have problems is they overstep and they kind of try to, inject themselves sometimes into operational decisions that don't make sense. And so as a CEO, I think one of the most important things for you to do is manage your board in a good way, which is kind of present the things to the board that the board should opine and give advice on, right? So if you're going to present, the financial operating plan for the year, that's a very good thing where the board should say, yes, we agree we should spend X amount of money, and these are the high-level priorities we should do, and this is how much, options we should be doing. But if you start to bring things to your board that kind of start to become operational, I think it causes the board, number one, to think about whether you actually have control of some of those operational issues, and then you kind of invite, I think, that bad behavior of board members probably overstepping their bounds, and so it's a careful balance.
So what you've described there, most of you guys, any of you guys working on a startup where you are dealing with these issues right now? Raise your hand if you're dealing with boards. So there's maybe one or two teams, okay. But the vast majority, they're not there yet.
Right.
So to prepare for the moment that they have a board and they've got funding and all of that stuff. The scary part is that early part is pain because you have no money for a long time and then suddenly you get money and then now you need to learn all this stuff about managing your board, hiring the right people, all of that stuff. So what should they, from your experience of seeing a pattern of success and fail, what do the teams that win, what did they get, what have they prepared properly for, and what have the ones that failed, where do they die?
Yeah, I think that, so the teams that do well, I think number one, recognize what they know and what they don't know. And I know that sounds kind of a little bit like mother and apple pie, but I think the reality is, look, you don't have to, no one believes or no one expects you to be omniscient on everything else, right? And look, I can tell you as a venture capitalist, we back people all the time who've never been CEO before. In fact, I was saying to somebody the other day, oftentimes we back people who never had a job before. So, we're not expecting you to all of a sudden magically become, Steve Jobs or whoever your esteemed CEO model is that you think
and
about.
Theranos is an example of when someone presents themselves as that.
I think that's right.
That's a warning sign.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
And so, look, I think VCs are very forgiving about that, which is what are the things you don't know? And I think part of the job of the VC is to help you navigate those things. So, one of the things that we do, for example, at Andreessen Horowitz is, look, you probably don't know, if you're not a finance person, if you've never been a CEO before, you probably don't know what should a CFO look like, right? What are even the characteristics of that job that I care about? And then once I understand what that is, how would I ever know what world-class is if I've never actually managed a CFO before? And I think those are good and valuable things to talk with your VCs about and solicit their input on. So I think where people get into trouble is they assume that everybody believes that they need to know everything, and therefore they're not willing to ask questions. Now, you certainly don't want to kind of go in there and kind of make the board feel like you have absolutely no idea how to what's going on in your business. So I think your job is to know what's happening day to day in your business. Your job is to know what the business is capable of delivering from a product and a sales and engineering perspective and otherwise. But I think it's perfectly reasonable to say, okay, I'm not sure if now is the right time to bring on a head of sales, or if now is the right time to upgrade from my buddy here who's running engineering to somebody maybe who has more skill or in that area. Those, I think, are perfectly good things, and you should be relying on your board for that.
Right. So, you talked about team before, and that's one of the things that we highlight a lot in our program. We do a lot of team dynamic development, getting students to what we call be team promiscuous.
Yes.
So you test out different teammates to see how that you connect and how you conflict. So from your experiences, maybe you could share some stories of team dynamics that worked and ones that didn't, and because there were surprises. If you thought there were going to be failures, you wouldn't have done it. So what are the surprises of working with people where you might be able to share a lesson?
Yeah, so the biggest failure case I think we've seen on teams is, often, there's more than one founder in a lot of these companies. And I think the biggest failure case we see is people assume that the jobs they're doing and the contribution they're making to the company is going to be static and enduring over time. And what I mean by that is, I've got my partner and we've decided we're going to go start a company, whatever it is we're doing. And we assume, number one, that our attention to the company and the skill sets that we bring to the company are, ever present and immutable, and we'll each be contributing exactly the same as we've always expected we would to the company. And more often than not, what happens over time is, which is not surprising, is one person tends to kind of one person ultimately has to become the CEO, and they may or may not be successful in that role. But you start to see changes in what looked like a purely equal partnership to hierarchical decision making. And inevitably, it either, if you haven't had these discussions before, it either breeds communication challenges within those teams, or sometimes you find that one of the co-founders just decides, look, I don't want to be here anymore, right? Because this is not what I expected it would be, and my job has changed over time. And the biggest challenges that you see there are not just obviously, look, separation is hard and nobody wants to deal with that, but then how people think about economic remuneration and what that means changes, right? So if we started the company and we divvied up equity, for example, 50-50, because we assumed that that reflected what our contributions over the next 10 years would be to the company, I'd say the biggest disputes that I see between founders are, you end up kind of going through that founder divorce, and all of a sudden you have somebody who's got,
Well, walk us through that divorce.
Yeah.
What are the indications that there's an imminent divorce? When you guys see dynamics happening on a team, when do you say, I think this is not going to end well?
Yeah, typically, at least where you start to see it is when you start to kind of see this separation between people who were kind of, let's just call it co-CEOs, even though such a thing doesn't exist, but where they were kind of viewed as and perceived themselves as equals in the organization, all of a sudden somebody starts to take on more responsibility, right? And it's not always a recipe for failure, but managing that process is really important because, look, it's human nature. There are hurt feelings on those types of things. You feel like, if you're the other person who hasn't been elevated, right, you feel like, this isn't quite what you signed up for. So it's when you start to see that kind of segregation of duties and separation of roles where I think, as a board member, you got to start thinking critically about, okay, is there a problem here, or do we feel like this is a natural transition we can manage?
Right.
Now,
so that's the
problem
indicator that you see from
Right.
afar. Okay.
Yeah. Now the problem is, look, there's not much you can do. There's not a whole lot you can do if it starts to go south at that point in time, right? Which is, if you think about if you've, given out all the equity, for example, or you've done other things that really aren't changeable at that point in time, then it's really, I think the only thing you can do as a board member is help that CEO hopefully navigate that process so that maybe there is a good role in the company where the co-founder can go to or otherwise.
Right, and so that's what you want to avoid, or that seems like there's some inevitable dynamics that will occur over time if there's a team, right?
Yep.
So at the front end, you probably want to prevent or minimize the chances of these things happening. So when you guys are looking at the deal flow coming, and since you guys are one of the top firms, you're going to see all the best deals. And this is a question one of the students has asked me to ask you, what do you see? What is the thing that triggers? Because there's the logical argument that you say, okay, we're going to go through their business model, there's the market thing, not the business school analysis, but what is the gut? What is the thing that you see, you're like, I want to invest in that.
Yeah.
What is it?
Yeah. So it's 90%. So, you've referenced it. It's 90% team, okay? So, and I'll talk about a little bit what we mean by that, right? So think about it though this way, right? Which is, once we've decided, for example, that the market size is big, right? And we can talk more about
the hygiene factors.
Right, the hygiene factors of look like, so the question right at early stage, the way I like to think about it is the question at early stage is, what if this company were successful? What could it look like, right? That's, I think, the early stage question you're trying to ask. Now, when you get later stage, the question is is this business working, and do I think it can scale and grow into
So
a
let me
business?
maybe highlight that distinction. So at the beginning is, what are the possibilities? The cone of possibility
That's right.
doesn't mean this is the cone of probability.
That's exactly right.
So if the world looks very large,
Right.
then you know you have a lot of playground to play
That's exactly
within
right.
to
Yeah.
then make the model work.
That's exactly right. Because the way to think about it from a financial perspective is, for anybody who follows this, is think about an option, right? Essentially, at the end of the day, right, what you're interested in as an early stage investor, you're buying essentially a long dated option, okay? And we don't need to do black shoals here, but options are more valuable the longer the time to expiration and the more volatility, right? Those are basically the drivers of what makes an option valuable, right? And so in the early stage, right, we're trying to think, okay, what is the range of possible outcomes? That's kind of your proxy for volatility. And then, of course, we do have the benefit of time because we have funds that are 10 years, 12 years, they go on for a long time. So that's essentially the way to think about it. And you're right, the conception is, okay, what are the things that could go right to make this company be a Facebook or a Twitter or something of that order of magnitude?
So then after you guys are interested, then you look at, and after you've invested, then there's this whole analysis to make it a business. And that's a different exercise.
It is,
It might be a different team too,
It
right?
could be, yeah, it could be.
Because going from aspirational possibility
Right.
to then narrowing it down. I'm thinking about the Twitter story
Exactly,
where
right,
at the beginning they had all these different ideas, right?
Right.
And then eventually they narrowed to what was
I think
Twitter,
that's right, yeah.
right?
And that doesn't mean that, again, at the early stage, doesn't mean you as an entrepreneur don't have to have thought through those things, right? So, but the way we describe it is we're more interested in your idea maze around what the business could look like as opposed to, I don't really care what the spreadsheet says, right? We all know we can make the spreadsheet say whatever we want. What's more interesting to me is, okay, like how have you conceptually thought about if you're able to build this company, what could that business look like, right? And again, no one's making a bet on the actual numbers there, but it's a little bit of, I talk about this in the book, it's kind of like a what if analysis, right? What do I need to believe to think that Airbnb at an early stage could become, a multi-billion-dollar company,
So
right?
let's talk about that one, right? There's famous stories of Airbnb, and I think they published the emails of the VCs that passed. So which companies did you guys pass on that you wish you got a mulligan?
Yeah,
that's a tough spot.
Yeah, it's tough. So let me talk about a couple. So let me talk about Airbnb specifically, and then let's talk about some others. So Airbnb, we did pass on the initial round, the first round of financing, which Sequoia, to their credit, did. And where we made a mistake, and this is, I think, a big mistake, unfortunately, that we made, and where I think other venture capitalists is, we made a market size mistake. Okay, and so let me take 30 seconds to give you VC 101 just to make sure this makes sense.
Listen to this one, guys.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here's the way our business works, right? Out of 10 deals, 3 to 5 of them are going to be what's called impaired, which is a very polite way of saying you lost all your money, okay? And then you get a couple deals where you make a little bit of money, and it turns out if you look over a long period of time in VC, the only thing that matters is do you have 1 or 2 of your deals out of 10 that actually can become, you can make 10, 20, 30, 40 times your money, right? Or hopefully more than that, right? And so if you're a baseball fan, right, the baseball analogy is it's how many home runs you hit and the magnitude of those home runs is the metric. The metric about batting average, how many times you get on base, is just not a relevant measure of success in this business. So the reason I say that is that leads you to market size as a very important factor for a VCs, right? Which is, there's lots of mistakes in this business, but a cardinal mistake is you invest in something that turns out to be a good business, but the scale of the market just isn't that big, and therefore, no matter how good of a business is, it can never be a multi-billion-dollar business and be in that upper right quadrant.
And this is why there's a huge focus on software, right, in the Valley.
Exactly,
because
right.
This obsession with market size and getting quick access to the market.
Market size, economies of scale, right, kind of improving economics over time, yes, all of that goes into that. So the question then, and the mistake we made for Airbnb was, believe it or not, Airbnb at the time, the original idea, for those of you who may not remember, the original idea of Airbnb was people sleeping on other people's couches, right? So it came from the founding team actually was having trouble paying their rent, and there was a convention of business people coming into town in San Francisco, and they literally rented out their couch to business people in lieu of hotels as a way to, help them cover their rent. And so when we first saw it, we were too myopic in our thinking about market size, right? We said, okay,
Well, when's the last time did you sleep on a couch?
Exactly. Well, that's exactly right.
Right,
And that was
right.
our view, right? And this is unfortunately the problem, right? Yeah, with VCs, unfortunately, sometimes evaluating businesses is you intuit from your own experiences, right? And so we said, okay, the only people I know who sleep on couches are probably people in this room who are starving college students.
Right. That's legitimately true, actually.
Right.
10% of them actually do live on
That's
couches.
right. And they also eat lots of ramen and mac and cheese, and so maybe those are proxies for market size for Airbnb. Is how big is the ramen market?
It's now organic ramen.
Right, exactly, right. So
it is Berkeley.
So anyways, I'm being a little bit facetious, but I think the mistake we made was not being able to think more critically about market size, which is, and in particular, a market like that where the presence of an application or utility actually causes the market size to grow, right? Because the other mistake people made over time, which is understandable, is you say, okay, look, a good proxy for the market size for Airbnb is hotels, right? Okay, so instead of staying in a hotel, I can stay in an Airbnb, and so therefore, that should be a reasonable market size. Well, it turns out if you look at the data today, of course, the number of nights stayed in Airbnbs is something like 10x whatever the largest hotel chain is. So just the mere fact that Airbnb exists meant more people are traveling than they would have before because there are new avenues that are open to them.
Right.
So it's a long way of saying, look, we made that mistake at the A round. Now, the good news in this business is sometimes you get a chance to fix your mistakes. We fixed that mistake in the B round, but the valuation delta, which I'm embarrassed to say, and I probably am not permitted to say, is pretty big between the A and the B round for a company that's growing like that. So, luckily for us, the company has done well, and so the B round investment will be a fantastic investment regardless. But I sure would have liked to have been the A round investor.
So part of I just want to go back to what you talked about is it created its own market. So you're almost making the argument that supply side works.
That's exactly right.
In some cases, this is a case that it works.
I think that's right. I think there's a bunch of ways to think about markets, right? So one way to think about a market is, look, we are going after an existing market and we are effectively a replacement, right? And those are easy to imagine, right? So I'll give you an example. We are an investor in a company called Tanium, which actually happens to be based in Berkeley here, which is an enterprise security company. So they do what's called endpoint security, which is basically make sure that all your devices are properly patched, and so you don't have security problems. That's a great market, but it's as a venture capitalist, it's a very easy market to understand because there are existing companies today who have technology that we think, of course, is not as exciting as Tanium, but you can intuit what the size of that market is pretty clearly.
And you
right?
can see the increased spend of each enterprise
That's exactly
every
right.
year for security
That's
issues,
exactly
and
right.
that becomes a closed system.
That's exactly right. You can kind of say, look, there are X number of enterprise companies that could buy this, and the average price point based on what we know today is this, and therefore you can kind of bottoms up build a market. Right. So that's easy market. The harder markets are things where the existence of a service actually creates a market that didn't exist and or expands a market. So we're an investor in Lyft, right? And so that's an example where, again, people often made the mistake on market size because they said, look, the taxi market is the best proxy for that. Now, and at the time, somebody just told me this the other day, I didn't realize it. At the time, when Lyft and Uber as well were raising money, a lot of people were using the taxi market. And I think, a few years ago, the taxi market in San Francisco was about $100 million a year, right? So that's basically the sum total of money that people spend on taxis. If you look today, based on, I think, what I recently read, I think Lyft and Uber combined do $1.5 billion in San Francisco alone today on their service. Now, that's pretty amazing, right? You don't often see 15x increases in a market size. But it goes to this question of, look, the presence of a service makes sense and the presence of a platform, right? Lyft and Uber would not work but for the fact that we all have supercomputers in our pockets and they're all GPS enabled.
And they've removed 100,000 parking spots in San Francisco, so you can't drive there anymore anyway.
That's exactly right, too,
So
right, yes, exactly.
That was useful, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Consumer habits in that sense. Really,
But
like
those are the hard things. And look, and that's where I think sometimes we make mistakes too. So, kind of sometimes we let our imagination get away from us, and sometimes we imagine a world. I think a lot of mistakes in venture capital can be time-based mistakes, which is, I believe that, I certainly believe we will have drone delivery, kind of very soon here. The question always with that is now the time to invest? How long will those markets take to mature?
Issue, like
it's a timing question. Right, exactly, right, yeah.
So what is a company that's out there? Many of our students are going out to careers and may end up at one of these companies, but which one did you pass on that surprised you? That you're like, now I get it. Yeah. But back then, it just didn't make sense.
Yeah, I'll give you one company, and then I'm going to give you a category of companies. Okay, so a company that we did pass on many times, unfortunately, was Square. And the challenge with Square, we saw the original round of Square. For those, I assume everybody knows what Square is, right? At the time when they were initially raising money, Jack Dorsey was not the CEO of the company. He was actually the chairman of the company, and there was another person named Jim McElvey who was actually the CEO. And we really, we knew Jack well, and we really felt like Jack would be, the better person, just to be able to run that business. We passed on it at the original time, but and about 3 months later, of course, Jack decided he would become CEO of the company, and obviously has been CEO ever since and done a great job. And I think our mistake there was not, not realizing that somewhat of Jack's capabilities would recognize and determine, kind of fairly quickly that kind of, his leadership of that company could really take it to new
So that was a team organizational.
It was a team organization thing,
push.
right? Yeah. And look, the idea made sense to us. They had some really interesting things. The other piece of this, right, is you have somebody like a Jack Dorsey who is incredibly talented in his own right as a manager, but also, has, we call these, there are kind of celebrity CEOs, and I mean that in a positive way, not a denigrating way, which is he has a reach and he has a network and he has an ability to do things.
To draw natural
That's exactly right.
attention.
He has relationships with people who can help from a business development perspective, right? And I think sometimes we underappreciate kind of that skill set.
It also comes with risk, right?
It does.
I mean, it
does.
could have ended up completely different.
Absolutely, no doubt about that. No doubt about that, right? There could have been a very different ending,
Yeah.
but the ending that we all see now is we left a very good investment opportunity on the table. And then the category of companies that I would comment on, which again really goes back to our market size discussion, is enterprise applications. And I know that doesn't sound very sexy, but so. When I grew up, and I'm not going to guess what era you grew up in, but
we're in the same.
All right,
area.
we're in the same. Okay, we're in the same ballpark. Okay, so in the enterprise software world, the way enterprise software worked was you would sell to a centralized buyer, right? You would sell to the CIO or the CTO of the buyer, and then you would hope that the utilization of the application would over time percolate down into the business. Among the many benefits of SaaS applications, right, software as a service applications, is that you can now in many cases, disintermediate the CEO or the CIO, and you can sell what's called bottoms up in the organization, right? So you can go to department levels, because the critical gating factor for application deployment in the old world was the IT organization had to support an application on premise, right? They had to literally, as we talked about, they had to buy servers, they had to, customize the application, they were responsible every time it broke. And of course, for any of you who use SaaS applications, that is now all the responsibility of the vendor themselves, as opposed to the internal IT organization. And so I think what that's done for a lot of us, and I think we kind of look critically at this opportunity as well, is I think you can easily underestimate market size opportunities that are a function not of necessarily new things like a Lyft or an Airbnb, but new methods of delivery, new methods of selling and go to market in a way that didn't exist before. And so the size of these companies is just dramatically larger than I think anybody thought they would be, in part because they have a very effective and efficient cost of customer acquisition in a way that didn't exist before.
So I want to mention something. So I was in enterprise software, and my company was in the bring your own device world and bring your own applications. We were pushing that whole, what he just described, that whole area. And we did pitch to Andreessen and they passed. So it's consistent with what you said. We got funded by another firm, but.
I'm sorry about that.
No, it's okay. And actually they had all the right reasons. You have to go sell to the CIO. This idea that the CIO would allow iPhones to be on their secure network. This is ridiculous. Yeah. Everyone's going to still use BlackBerries. Right. Does anyone still use a BlackBerry? Yeah. Some of you guys, well, the only Canadian. Right. So it was funny because we were not arguing a technology problem. Right. We were actually not arguing this point of the technology, but whether the social behavior was different. We were saying we're seeing people just bring in their iPhones. It doesn't matter what the CIO says, but it was this question of whether that was going to be the new world or not. And the VCs that bet on the bring your own device world.
Well, it's a great example of a real problem that I think exists in venture world, which is sometimes experience is a bad thing, right? And so sometimes we use this term internally, which is, are you fighting the last war, right? Which is, and oftentimes we find that for example, when we first started the firm, lots of people would pitch us opsware, LoudCloud-like ideas, right? We would get all kinds of stuff like that. And we never funded any of them because we're like, we know all the things that are wrong with this business that will, we were just jaded. We were literally had PTSD from running that business, right? And so, in many ways, sometimes, experience with a product category is actually the worst thing as a VC because you immediately go to all the things that you remember that are problems, and you're not open to things like this where there is a new delivery model where BYOD actually does matter, and the CIO doesn't have the centralized control they used to. So.
And I do this with students as well, is when they ask me, oh, you've been in mobile, do you have any advice? I'm like, if you ask me for advice, I will tell you don't do it.
Right, exactly.
Because I know all of the things in my previous life that didn't work. That does not necessarily mean that it's not going to work now.
Yeah.
So what is the future then? Because here's, segueing into that, since there is no ghost of Christmas future here, I'll stand in for that.
Future.
So, we have students here, and I mentor many of them. Some of them still hate me because I tell them stop gunning for jobs that they saw as freshmen. Because by the time they're seniors, those companies won't be hot anymore.
Exactly.
So I have several students here probably going off to Facebook, and I've told them since they're a freshman, it will not be the company that you saw. And it's not, because now they're dealing with regulatory issues, with data issues. The shine wears off in 4 years. So where should a freshman in this room, looking at where their career should go, two questions. What degree, other than CS, what other degree should they be maybe dual or looking at? And what business area, what industry area do you think will be hot in 4 years?
All right, so I'm going to give you two answers to that question. So the first answer I'm going to give you is the honest answer, which is I don't know, and I'm not sure it's my job to know.
Fair.
Which is the way I view our job is we need to be in front of all the most interesting entrepreneurs and, quite frankly, let them pull us into markets and areas that we don't know. And so that's kind of, and we use this term internally called the prepared mind, right? Which is we need to have ideas about where industries are going. But this is an outlier business, and so we need to be open-minded enough to kind of learn new things. So that's answer number one. Now, answer number two, look, from a very high level, look, I think, at least I'll tell you personally what I think some of those interesting areas are. We more recently have been doing stuff at the intersection of computer science and life sciences. And there is a big meta thesis, which I don't know exactly over what time period it'll play out, but over the many, this is not new, but over many years, biology in particular has become much more computational, right?
We're the land of CRISPR.
Yes, right, exactly, right. Yeah, and look, obviously Berkeley has done tremendous things there.
Right.
And so the idea that kind of all the things that happen in the computer industry over the last 50 years, I think there's a very reasonable theory that kind of a lot of those things can get replicated on the life sciences side, which is cost of inputs start to come down, availability of data starts to go up, processing power of computers starts to go up. And so to me, like some of the most fascinating things that we are investing in are things that are at that intersection.
So informatics, that kind of like healthcare. And
informatics, or think about as applications of machine learning into life sciences, right? So, is there a better way to do drug discovery than wet lab biology, and can we use computers to help facilitate that process? And look, these are all, massive problems, and none of these will be solved overnight, but to me, that's a super interesting area.
Anything that's not software.
Look, so I would say, as you know, we have this thesis that software is eating the world, and so it would be bad of me to kind of diverge from that
but what would
thesis.
be eating software?
Yeah, I don't know if it's eating software. I think the way I would think about it is look at where all the big spend is in GDP and think about areas where software hasn't really penetrated. So if you really think about it, as much as we talk about software eating the world, basically all software is done, it's probably eaten media or is eating media, right? So the media industry is very different than it was. But look, software really hasn't put a dent at all into the education market. Quite frankly, it's done very little in the healthcare market. It's done nothing in terms of government and government services. It's done almost very little in oil and gas or energy. And so if you think about where 80+% of GDP is, that's the other things that I would be thinking about, which is there a reason to think or not, and maybe this is to your answer, maybe it's not software, but is there a reason to think that automation and analytics and data can't transform those industries in the same way that it has at least started to transform. Look, financial services, even tiny bits of financial services.
So that is the course description of Scott's class in our program next spring. So any of you who are interested, seriously, we'd love for you to come and teach that, because it sounds like if you're throwing down the mantle and saying these are the marketplaces that haven't been penetrated enough with the types of skills and the network that you have, we'd invite you to come in and see if we can innovate.
You want me to defend that argument?
Well, yeah. With the students that we have here,
exactly.
I think there could be several billion-dollar companies that could come out of that.
I'd be happy to do that. I'd be happy to do that.
I'd love to transition to questions for the students. Maybe, Vicky, you have...
Yeah, I think we have questions. I just want to say it is so fun to see the three of you from such different backgrounds, like the lawyer, the student, the history major, all talking together.
I'm all about encouraging students to get a liberal arts degree.
I think that's great. I think that's great too. I really do. Yeah.
I mean,
Look, I don't want
science.
to. Yeah. By the way, let me be totally clear. I mean, look, if you know you want to do computer science, that's great. You should do computer science. But look, I also think you can't fit yourself into something that doesn't provide you intellectual stimulation. It doesn't provide you excitement. Look, you're going to be working. I have three girls who are all in school. My oldest is going to be starting college in the fall, and she decided to take a gap year, in between starting. And I told her the same thing, which is, look, you're going to work for 50 plus years probably in your career, and if you can't find something that kind of gets you going every day and is exciting, like. It doesn't make any sense. Yeah.
50, yeah. Your generation is going to live a long time. Yeah. So that's actually a good thing.
Maybe 60 years.
Yeah.
No, I want to be totally clear. I'm not at all suggesting that computer science is the end all be all for everybody at all. I think you have to decide what you like and what you're good at. And look, there are lots of jobs, as we know, in companies that are not engineering or computer science jobs that do require other skill sets.
Right. And you are, you became a lawyer, and that's all these other it's the things that make you different and odd or abnormal or quirky that make you stand out in your career.
Totally
right?
agree.
Yeah.
So let's transition over to Jordan. And if you don't mind, introduce yourself and your background, what you're studying.
Sure. Hello, my name is Jordan Coffey. I'm a biologist and architect here at Cal. So kind of interesting.
Biology and architecture, that's cool.
And my question for you is, with most venture capital dollars going towards like Facebook through ads or Amazon Web Services, what is a great way for companies or things that you've seen to keep their cost of customer acquisition low?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So this is the major conundrum with consumer companies today is, can you acquire customers in a way that actually is profitable? And look, the beauty of things like Facebook and Google AdWords, because they didn't exist before, is they do kind of jumpstart and they give you a channel that never existed before, right? So I know that a lot of these companies are very maligned, in the press today. But in many respects, they are a very valuable part of the startup ecosystem in that, kind of particularly for companies getting started, you used to have no way to actually communicate with your end user customers in a way that you can through Google AdWords and Facebook. Now, the problem, of course, over time, as everybody knows, right, is as you scale, those do become very expensive and in many cases prohibitively expensive opportunities. So I think there's no simple answer, but I think you've got to think about, is there some hack around customer acquisition that allows you to find a scalable model to do it? And so what I mean by that is, let me give an example. We're an investor in a company called Affirm. I don't know if anybody knows Affirm, right? So Affirm is started by a gentleman named Max Levchin, who was one of the founders of PayPal. And what Affirm does, essentially think about it as they provide financing for, kind of point of sale purchases, right? So if I want to buy a mattress from Casper, then instead of paying whatever it costs, $1,500, Affirm will offer me some payment plan, which is essentially a financing plan, right? Is what they're doing. And in that case, right, the way, as opposed to them having, a bunch of Google AdWords and Facebook ads around financing for mattresses, they essentially, and I mean this in a positive way, they're essentially piggybacking off of customer acquisition that Casper or any of the other e-commerce partners that they work with has, right? And that doesn't mean it's free to them, but that's an interesting kind of, I would call it a hack I mean that in a positive way, which is it's a way to think about a more scalable customer acquisition model where they don't have to kind of, buy the keywords for lease financing, in Google. Instead, they probably, I don't know, I'm guessing they might have some revenue share deal with Casper where essentially, a customer that comes through the Casper website that ultimately, works with the firm, I'm guessing this, I don't know, but might have some revenue share. So I think just thinking critically about things like that.
But the play there is almost as if they're an enterprise company.
That's exactly right, right. So you kind of
enterprise.
almost have to think about, right, this is a weird way to say it, but kind of B to B to C, right? Which is, okay, is that resonant? Does people know what I'm talking about when I say that, right? So yeah, and look, yeah, so what I mean by that is kind of, B to C would be, okay, look, I'm going to go buy Google Ads. If a firm's strategy was I'm going to buy Google Ads and I'm going to buy the keyword for, lease financing or whatever the right keywords are, they are marketing directly essentially to a customer to acquire that customer. In B to B to C, instead, they are, really marketing to a business who then is ultimately acquiring the customer on their behalf, right? And it doesn't work for every industry, but I guess my general advice is I think you just need to think critically about, are there other ways to kind of go about that and there's nothing wrong with using Google and Facebook as a portion of that, but I think you have to also find other ways that potentially are more scalable over time.
So we have a good 10 to 15 minutes and we have a bunch of questions.
Okay, sorry, I'll be faster.
Hi, my name is Devesh Agarwal. I'm a second-year student studying data science and business.
Great.
I have a short question. I want to work at Andreessen Horowitz. How do I get there?
That was pretty direct.
That's pretty direct. That's good. So what I would tell you is, so you want to work there like now, or you want to work there when you graduate, or 10 years from now, or? When I graduate. So look.
In what role
Yeah.
though? Like, what do you want to do? Like,
you want to be an investor?
A janitor? Do you want to be I mean, you got to be very clear what you want from because you get one shot. You get one shot.
If janitor's the way to go, then that's fine.
You'll
but
do that.
See, I teed that one up. That's good.
Ideally, I want to work in a role that I can bring whatever expertise I have from my education, but take more expertise away from the job.
Yeah. So look, number one, I'm happy we can talk more, or you can email me separately. But in general, we in venture capital firms do not hire. We hire a very small number of people directly out of school, and that's probably a historical anomaly more than anything else. But look, I think the best way to position yourself is think about like what would make you valuable to a venture capitalist, right? So the things that we love are do you understand what's happening in the startup ecosystem, right? As evidenced by you've built a network of relationships, and I'm not expecting college students to be angel investors, but just are you involved, right? Do you know people? Do you on the weekends do you spend your time talking to people about startups and stuff like that? So what helps us understand and believe that you can add value, even if you haven't had other experiences outside of that, right? Having theses on industries, right? So maybe you have an idea of, maybe you have a better answer than I do as to what the future looks like in terms of jobs. So those are at least the kinds of things where I think you can position yourself and have a conversation with the venture capitalists about that would make you valuable to them. And then, again, there's no doubt you will learn a lot as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hello. All right. My name is Jeremy, and I'm a business student right now. And I'm currently working on a project with my friends that helps you and your friends decide what to do on a Friday night using group preference learning. But recently, we heard Facebook's shifting their entire platform towards that kind of focus. So I'm kind of figuring out what kind of factors should I look at in determining whether I should continue with this project.
So I don't know what Facebook's doing, but. The mere fact that Facebook has announced they're doing it, to me, kind of is not necessarily a reason to not do what you're planning to do. So there are, look, big companies do lots of things. As you can imagine, in a place like Facebook, for a new project to get critical mass in terms of, the scale of what it needs to look like, for it to ultimately, kind of be in a business they invest in that's a pretty tall task. So I guess I wouldn't assume just because you've heard something that's necessarily the case and view that as a deterrent. To me, the real question is, look, when you sit down and you think about the business, do you believe there is a way, are you offering a service or a product that you think is uniquely differentiated in the market? Can you acquire customers in a way that is reasonable, relative to what the kind of value or the, kind of the profitability you can determine from those customers? Those are, to me, the fundamental questions that I think you should think about as to whether this is a good business or not. And then, yes, I think, look, it's a real question, which is, look, if you really believe Facebook's putting 10,000 people against this, my guess is that's going to change your assumptions, right? Which is it may be that customer acquisition is not what you thought it was if you have somebody like that doing it. But I wouldn't jettison your idea yet. I would go do that work, which is, okay, what do I need to believe that would enable me to think this has value and that it can actually function as a business.
Can I just add a little color to that? That's a special case. Facebook is a special case in that they own so much of the acquisition market. So if you can't use Facebook to get customers because they're your competitor, that's different. There are a lot of other industries where there might be competitors that jump in. I think Google is a classic example. If they jump in, the likelihood of them winning is really low because they suck at commercializing anything other than search. So they're validating that, hey, this is a market, but there's plenty of proof. Facebook is actually proof that you can beat Google at social network. There's mapping companies they had to buy with Waze. So there's plenty of evidence that can happen, but I think with Facebook, they own such a channel to customers. If you compete with them there might be that might be weird.
Yeah,
that might be harder.
Yeah, look, Facebook's an incredible company. We were lucky enough to be invested in it. My partner Mark sits on the board of the company, and so yeah, I just want to be clear. My point was not that they can't be successful there. My point was just that just because you may hear they're doing something, it may be a long way between a product actually being kind of on the roadmap before there really is an earnest effort there. And look, I'm sure there's lots of ideas that percolate that never actually materialize in terms of product. So I wouldn't give up yet.
My name is Suyash. I'm a freshman studying IOR and econ here at Berkeley. I think you're perfectly positioned to answer this question. And essentially, it's about, as an investor for Lyft and seeing how all these new currently loss-making startups are going about with their IPOs and stock listings. What is your opinion on the comparison with the past 2000 dot-com crash and any trends that you see, and where do you think this is heading in the future?
Yeah, so this is a great question. If you follow me on Twitter, you'll see actually a tweet storm from Saturday on this very topic. So, but you can check me out. So yeah, let me give you some commentary. So I can't talk about Lyft per se because it's a company that we're invested in, but let me talk about what I think is happening in the market. Okay, so let's talk about first the comparison to 99-2000 because I think it's a very obvious comparison that people want to make, and I think it's a great story. I personally think it's very different. So let me just give you some data. So 99-2000, there were over 700 IPOs that happened in that 2-year period, okay? In the 10-year period from 2009 until 2018, we've had 450 IPOs, okay? Over a decade, we have done 2/3 of what we did in 99-2000. I briefly mentioned this earlier. If you look at average revenue of a company when they went public in 99-2000, $17 million. In the decade from 2009 to 18, about $170 million, okay? And then, not surprisingly, therefore, when you look at valuation metrics, right? So I think the median valuation metric of a 1999 IPO was 45 times revenue, and it was about 6.5 times revenue here. So that's not to say that we can't repeat 99-2000, but I would say that it's very different. And the biggest, I think, to me, the reason why it's different is a couple things. Number one is companies are staying private dramatically longer than they ever did before. So if you look over the history of venture capital, on median time from founding a company to going public is about 6.5 years over about the 45-year period. Today, it's about 10 to 12 years. As a result, not surprisingly, that's why revenue is much bigger. And then the other thing that's very different, which again, it's always dangerous, but I think is true, is the market size opportunity, the size of what winners can be is just very different. So my partner Mark likes to talk about, he was the founder of Netscape, which my guess is probably half of this room doesn't even know what Netscape is. But if you don't know what Netscape is, it was the first commercialization of what we all know as the browser today. When Netscape was sold to AOL in 1998, the total size of the addressable market was about 80 million people, right? Meaning that there were literally 80 million people on the internet globally. And again, you probably don't remember this, but they were all using dial-up modems, right? Today, right, however you count it, whether you count mobile phones, but it's somewhere between 3 and 5 billion people, right? And it's, obviously we've got ubiquitous access. And so that doesn't mean that every startup idea is a good idea, but it does mean that the opportunity for a company like a Facebook to literally go from zero to today a $500+ billion company in 14 years, it never could have existed in the 99-2000 timeframe. So that's a little bit on 99-2000. What I think is happening today, the reason I think why, there was a big article in the Wall Street Journal, which I did this tweet storm on about the fact that there are money-losing companies going public, and people were worried about what that means. Let me caveat everything by saying, look, it's possible that the Wall Street Journal may be right in that, look, it's possible that some of these companies may not ultimately achieve profitability. I think that's a fair question. But just so you understand, what's happening, I think, is the public market investors are looking at these, and the reason they're interested is, number one, is there's very little growth to invest in the public markets. So a big change that's happened over the last really 15 plus years is most of the growth that used to exist in the public markets now exists in the private markets. I'll give you a quick example, right, which it's an extreme example, but it illustrates it. When Microsoft went public, Microsoft had a $350 million market capitalization when it went public 30 years ago. I don't remember exactly what the date was. Today, Microsoft is worth almost $1 trillion, actually.
Trillion today.
Yeah, it's $1 trillion today. Okay, great. It's $1 trillion today. So what's that math? 350 a trillion. So it's gone up almost 3,000x, right, in the public markets, roughly, right? Okay. Facebook goes public at $100 billion. It's today worth $500 billion, which is no small feat. That's tremendous. If you do the math, though, haven't done it now on 3,000. But if you posited that, could Facebook ever go up in the public markets the same amount that Microsoft has done? What would it be worth? It turns out to be worth more than global GDP, basically, right? And so as a Facebook shareholder, I would love that. That would be great. But my guess is that's not probably going to happen. Now, again, in fairness, that's an extreme example, right? 350 versus 100 billion. But what it does illustrate is the broader point that growth that used to exist in the public markets now having the private markets. What that then means is if you are a public market investor, when you see growth in the public markets, there is a demand, there's a supply-demand imbalance for it, which does drive the price, right? That causes price changes. So it's a long way of saying, look, I'm not, I don't want to be, kind of Pollyannish about, companies that are losing money in the public markets. But I think the bet that the public investors are making is that the growth is good, and that the market size is very big, and there are things that I can analyze today at the unit economics level that make me feel confident that, okay, in certain markets or in certain areas, there is profitability today, and so I can at least build a model and opine that over time, as other more mature markets get to profitability, the business as a whole can get there. Now, they may be wrong at the end of the day, but I think that's the rational process that they're going through.
So I want to ask.
Sorry, and I was a longer answer to your question.
This is good because I think the flip side of this, because the criticism of 99 and 2000, because I lived through this as well, is that the companies that were going public were not real. The value was not there, and so tech companies got. The tech industry, Silicon Valley, got really hit with this idea that we were creating these paper unicorns that really didn't exist, and that we were frauds. Okay, so that was kind of that was what we were painted with. But today, it's real. I agree with you. Absolutely, these companies have real value. They're creating real value, but they're at some expense. So what's happening is taxi companies are dying.
Absolutely.
The Yellow Pages have died. Car companies are struggling. They're laying people off. Transportation, Walmart's struggling. They were the jerks before, and now it's Amazon.
Yeah, hotel industry.
They're all consolidating. Marriott has become SPG. So there's the shift that technology companies are affecting, and that could have a wider effect on the economy, right? So we're not out of the clear, is my point.
Oh, right? I totally agree. Yeah. No, look, I totally agree. Look, I think that more so than ever, look, this is, it's a little bit of a joke, but look, it is true that software is eating the world in that respect, which is software is impacting, technology is impacting industries that it never impacted before. And you're right, it has very painful dislocations for a lot of people. I don't think we can ignore that, right? That is a real issue. Right. Now, if we, for those of you who study history, at least, we do know that kind of in previous kind of, industrial revolution type changes that happen in technology, in general, that the, kind of standard of living and economic value that's been derived has been, to the net benefit of everyone in the economy. I think what's different this time is the pace at which these changes are happening is different. And I also think, look, we know just from what we've seen that, there is a massive skills gap and an education gap in that I think we all, we probably all intuitively knew, but we never really appreciated that there are many things. This is an ongoing transition from a manufacturing services-based economy into a more knowledge economy.
And I just want to point out, he's a venture capitalist, but he is keeping aware of the public policy issues, the social issues, social impact issues. That's for all of you. Just being a STEM major, there's some benefits to that. You get 3-year visa if you're not an American citizen. Yay. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're employable unless you know about the greater impacts of the technology you're working on. I think he's an example of that. You have to stay connected with the world.
Absolutely.
So we're going to take one more question, and then hopefully, Scott, you'll be able to stay just a few minutes for people who have one-on-one.
Sure.
Our last question for the semester.
Hi, Scott. Thanks for being here. My name's Katie. I'm a third-year business student. So you touched upon my question in a few of your past answers, but I'm wondering what your take is on what has propelled the recent wave of D2C companies specifically, like the investments in the space, they're extremely high valuations. And on the previous question, or piggybacking off a previous question, I would really like to be best friends with Andrew Chen and Connie Chan.
Awesome.
So if you could set that up, that'd be great.
I'd be happy to do that. I don't know whether they will, be your best friend, but I can certainly at least give you that opportunity. So what's happening in B2C? So look, the honest answer is, look, there was kind of a lull in B2C for a long time, to be honest, right? Which is, and this goes in waves, right? So, look, in 2004, people thought B2C was dead too, and it turns out you get companies like Facebook and LinkedIn and all kinds of great stuff.
I just want to, B2C is business to consumer.
Oh, sorry. Yes,
thank you.
I'm
Just
sorry.
in case people don't know, B is always business, C is consumer.
Yes, thank you for that clarification. So there actually was a lull for a while because people felt like, look, what is the next platform, right? So really since, we're an investor in Pinterest, but Pinterest is a 10-year-old company now, right? And so if you look over the last 5 years, really after Snapchat, there hadn't been anything kind of, probably brand new that had come out. Now there were, it depends, there's obviously the whole category of kind of Uber, Lyft companies and Airbnb. Yeah, go ahead. You meant what? Sorry. D.
Like data or what?
What do you mean D2C?
Direct to consumer.
Oh, direct to DTC. I'm sorry, direct to consumer. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So, and your question is why haven't there been more, or why are there so many? Yeah. Yeah. Look, I think it's not an area that we invest in a lot, just to be completely blunt, right? They're really interesting businesses. I think the reason they're attractive from a venture capital perspective is they can grow very quickly on the top line, right? So if you look at companies you mentioned, Glossier, there's these new companies, Hims and others, right? There's a lot of these companies. They grow very fast, and so it can be very tempting as a venture capitalist to kind of you kind of buy the growth curve is essentially what you're buying. We don't do as much in those areas in part because we worry about long-term gross margin structures in some of those businesses. And we also, to the question we had earlier, we worry about long-term customer acquisition costs because a lot of these depend on paid acquisition, customer acquisition channels. And that works well at reasonably small volumes, but kind of that tends to degrade over time. So we have not done much in that area, but I think the reason, at least I believe the answer to your question about why they are interesting to people is because, look, you can go from 1 to 10 million to 50 to 100 million dollars if you get it right on those companies. And, it's, we often sometimes just extrapolate out from that and don't think more about it. That can be pretty attractive as an investment opportunity.
Scott, you have really kind of done 6 classes in one, I have to say, between the 3 of you. I want to thank you all very much. We'll give a big round of applause.
Thanks so much for your questions. It was awesome.